Dawn over the banks of the Volga seemed like a promise of light, but the clarity only served to better outline the geometry of horror. The ritual tent rose like a linen throat, taut on the inside, vibrating with chants that were not prayers but acoustic cover. Sigrid, 19 years old, her hair subdued by foreign hands, her steps taught to obey, was the center of a choreography that had begun 10 days earlier, when her name, or rather her body, was chosen to accompany the dead chieftain. "He calls me to his hall," she repeated in broken Norse, and each syllable was another taut thread in the loom of a programmed death. Outside, the community turned violence into liturgy. Inside, time became a thick substance that intoxication barely sweetened, so that she could speak, smile, and nod, without fully understanding that she had been turned into a bridge between two worlds to justify the destruction of just one, hers. They called her the Chosen One, a title that simulated honor and hid the technique of domination. During those 10 days, Sigrid ate better than ever, drank mead mixed with herbs that favored docility and visions, and received bracelets that were not jewelry but gleaming handcuffs. She was forbidden to be alone, even to cry. She was surrounded by two girls who, by dint of having seen this theater, had already learned to dispense tenderness as if it were an ointment, just enough for the victim to walk, never so much that she would try to flee. Every morning they put her on a platform and made her announce her visions. "I see my lord. He offers me a seat by the fire." The crowd celebrated. Not Sigrid, actually, but themselves, because the rite functioned as a mirror. It reflected back to them the image of an order where death is digested with symbols and property extends beyond the last breath. In the corner of the tent, the large, broad-shouldered woman with iron eyes heated a blade over the coals. She was the angel of death, an inherited trade, hands accustomed to closing transitions with efficiency. Her presence turned myth into procedure. There was rope to tighten, a knife to secure, coals to perfume the moment when the body would become an object in the object, an offering. Everything was arranged so that the community would believe in the purity of the surrender, and no one would have to look at the unadorned truth, that a slave would be strangled and stabbed to honor the vanity of a powerful man. The 6 warriors were waiting too. They had come on alternating nights to send messages to the deceased through Sigrid's living body. The chants rose in volume when they entered and lowered when they left, like a collective diaphragm regulating the air so that no scream would become testimony. "I do it out of love for my chieftain," each one declaimed upon leaving, and the phrase, repeated until empty, was the moral veneer of a useful custom, consolidating hierarchies in the present while offering the past an appearance of continuity. Sigrid's death, then, was neither an accident nor a whim. It was a cog in the machinery that welded the community together, turning pain into spectacle and spectacle into legitimacy. Beneath the ritual's surface beat an engineering of trauma. Sigrid was kept at a carefully calibrated threshold, lucid enough to recite, dazed enough not to stray from the script. That intermediate state, that gray area, was not merely pharmacological, it was psychological and social. They called her Chosen so she would collaborate in her own annihilation, an ancestral trick that crosses cultures. You can kill with knives or with meanings, and the latter leaves less visible blood. In Mesoamerica, a century later, other maidens would figure in tales as initiates who crossed to the sun. On the steps, some peoples would carry wives to the burial mound. The comparison excuses nothing. It underscores that where there is power and fear, women's bodies become currency, ritual, argument. The funeral ship waited like a stage. On its belly were piled weapons, rings, horses destined for the flames, dogs that had no choice. The tent on the deck, with fabrics stretched to cast shadows, would become a theater of silhouettes. 2 women holding hands, 2 men immobilizing ankles, the rope describing a circle that chokes, the blade entering where air no longer reaches. On land, hundreds of eyes would watch the purity of the gesture, because the rite, like any work of power, needs an audience. Watching without intervening was also part of the violence. Participation does not require touching. Believing is enough. What was Sigrid thinking in those final minutes? History rarely gives voices to those who were programmed to disappear, but one can attempt a clinical reading of the framing. Dissociation to tolerate the intolerable, a sensation of floating outside the body, the mind seeking tableaus of memory in which to take shelter. A kitchen in her village, a sister's laugh, the texture of linen before strange hands dressed her for another. The ritual which claimed to turn her into a messenger was erasing her as a subject. And yet, in the slight tremor with which she pressed her fingers against herself, one can imagine a minimal affirmation. Even here, even now, me. The community told itself that it was accompanying her. Big words, honor, transition, service, varnish the mechanics of coercion. It is the classic matrix of all normalized violence. Changing the name of things until suffocation is pronounced offering, domination is pronounced destiny, and cruelty adopts the grave tone of the sacred. In that twisted grammar, boys are educated so they see tradition instead of crime, and girls so they understand early on that their value depends on how much they contribute to the narrative of others. Therein lies the most disturbing aspect of the rite. It does not just kill a body, it founds a pedagogy. When the fire rose, the chants rose with it. The flames did not just consume wood and flesh, they stabilized in order. The metals turning red looked like small auroras within a dawn that had given up on illuminating. The smoke rose gently toward the east as if carrying some news, but the only certain message was earthly. Power had demonstrated once again that it could appropriate the labor, the time, and the end of women. That demonstration, repeated from Iceland to Russia, was a language everyone understood. Obedience. From the distance of the present, one might be tempted to think that all this belongs to a barbarous past, comfortably alien. That would be a mistake. The mechanism we see here, the aesthetics of ritual covering the logistics of violence, remains active in other geographies and with other vocabularies. Screens have replaced chants, press releases, the taut tent. The word necessary replaces sacred. But the trick persists, recruiting the community to legitimize what would otherwise be unbearable. The last vision Sigrid might have had was perhaps not of luminous halls or infinite tables, but of the calm river that, indifferent, continued its course. The water knows. What is not named settles at the bottom and returns with the whirlpools of time. That is why it is best to say it without adornments, even within the terrible beauty of this narrative. It was not destiny, it was a decision. It was not honor, it was domination. It was not a transition, it was murder. And her name, which was barely written down, deserves at least one firm syllable in the mouth of the listener. Sigrid, because every story that turns her into an instrument also saves her a little, if, in telling it, we restore the subject where they wanted to leave an object. The smoke eventually diluted into the pale sky. The crowd dispersed, satisfied. The angel of death gathered her tools with the same care another would put away spoons. The warriors, wiping hands and phrases, prepared for the next journey. The river, as always, did not judge, but memory, if we force it, can. And it begins here, on this bank, in this tent, in this dawn that seems beautiful only until one learns to see. On June 8, 793, the holy island of Lindisfarne became an altar of blood. Until that day, the monastery bells had marked hours of prayer, and the walls had guarded illuminated manuscripts that seemed to contain the very light of the gospel. But that morning, the Gregorian chants were replaced by screams in an unknown language and the metallic clash of swords. The chronicler who centuries later would write about that attack would call it the beginning of the end of the world. For the young nun Aldred, hiding in the dust of the barn, it meant the end of her innocence. She had spent 12 years copying Latin letters, convinced that each stroke was an offering to God. Now every stroke of her memory would be a scar. Through the wooden slats, she watched the invaders separate the women into different lines, like someone sorting cattle. Her friend Bridge, with hair as red as the fire of Pentecost, was dragged toward the beach. In another life, that brightness would have been a symbol of purity. Here it was a sentence. The Vikings sought beauty the way one seeks gold. Aldred held her breath, praying silently to a God who seemed distant, almost deaf. What could faith mean amidst the roar? When a rough hand ripped her from her hiding place, she understood that her vows of virginity were not a shield, but a target. The fall of Lindisfarne was not an isolated accident, but a spiritual earthquake for all of European Christendom. Chroniclers wrote that the sea had vomited dragons, that the devil himself had landed on the shores. They were not exaggerating. In medieval logic, seeing nuns turned into merchandise was equivalent to seeing the evil one desecrating temples. The monks murdered before the altar, the blood-stained chalices, the scattered relics, all of it was a message. The Christian God had been challenged by foreign gods, and the women torn from conventual protection became trophies of that symbolic victory. The journey to Norway confirmed what Lindisfarne had barely hinted at, that slavery was not improvisation, but structure. 40 women crammed into the hold, without space even to die with dignity, constituted the living demonstration of a learned and repeated logistics. The first night, hunger could still be confused with pious fasting. The second, thirst became a desperate prayer. On the third, some licked the moisture from the planks as if it were a profane communion. Aldred, who had read about Roman martyrs, thought that perhaps Christianity was doomed to always repeat itself in the flesh of defenseless women. The Vikings did not need to give speeches. Their method spoke for them. They grouped, classified, selected. In the eyes of a modern observer, it was an early laboratory of biopolitics, the power to decide who lived, who died, who served. In the eyes of the victims, it was the revelation that their God, until then a protector, seemed to have kept silent. The contrast between the liturgical chant of previous days and the guttural chants of the invaders pierced Aldred's memory. Every new sound became proof that the world she knew had been shattered. The impact of Lindisfarne extended far beyond the coast. In the following weeks, rumors traveled with merchants and pilgrims. There was talk of nuns raped on altars, of virgins stripped before crucifixes, of women dragged naked among torn Bibles. Even if part of those chronicles was embellished by fear, the essence was true. Female fragility had become a public theater of domination. What began as a military attack transformed into a catechesis of terror. Every convent in Europe knew from then on that stone walls were insufficient to contain the violence of godless men. Aldred survived the journey. When she was unloaded, her immediate fate was that of an agricultural servant. She naively believed that her friend Bridge would be better off, destined for the chieftain's hall. Over the years, she would discover that beauty was a crueler sentence than forced labor. But in that moment, she could still pray. And in the dust of the road, chained with others, she whispered a psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. The truth is that she did fear, and with good reason. The valley had no way out. The fall of Lindisfarne was more than a massacre. It was a baptism in blood of the new Viking order. The boundary between the sacred and the profane had been broken, and upon its ruins, the Norsemen built a system where women were both booty and message. A message for the defeated. Resisting was not worth it, and a message for posterity. Faith is not enough to stop those who make the female body a battlefield. The sea, which for the monks had been a symbol of pilgrimage and the horizon of the divine, transformed into a liquid prison for the captured women. The Viking ship, with its slender lines and taut sails, did not carry iron goods or furs that day. It carried bodies crammed together like bales. 40 women in a space meant for 20, a ratio that turned every breath into a struggle, every movement into forced friction. Aldred, who had previously copied Gospels, now copied with her skin the rough contact of strangers crying in different languages, all reduced to the same universal language, the groan. For the first 2 days there was no food, only water when the waves washed over the deck and the captives licked the soaked wood. Arab and Byzantine chronicles would speak of this with horror. Women forced to drink the salt that was drying them out from the inside. Some tried to pray, others simply counted the hours by the changing of the guard. Aldred, exhausted, discovered that even prayer became a burden when the stomach roared with fury. In the hold, time fragmented into visits. Sometimes warriors came down to choose, sometimes just to observe, like merchants inspecting cattle before an auction. That 11-day journey was an initiation into the system. The women learned to identify the footsteps. A light step meant a young man who might be coming down to impose violence. A slower step could be a veteran coming down to choose according to his right in the division of the spoils. Even in the dark, the prisoners knew they were not equal. Some were marked as future concubines, others as field workers. And there were those who no longer had any value other than as temporary cargo. Two died on the fifth day, one from hunger, another from despair. Their bodies were thrown into the sea without a word or symbol, and the water swallowed them as if they were part of the routine. What distinguished this trafficking from previous ones was the precision with which the profitability of suffering was calculated. The Vikings had built, without a written manual, an economic system that used female flesh as currency. Women were not just slaves, they were an investment, mobile capital that could multiply into children or be sold in distant markets. The details seem to anticipate the Atlantic slave ships centuries later. Overcrowding to maximize profits, minimal rations to reduce costs, constant rotation to prevent rebellions. The cruelty was not improvisation, but planning. On the fifth day, Aldred stopped praying, not because she had lost her faith, but because she understood that the God she invoked did not intervene in those holds. Perhaps, she thought, his role was different, not to save from death, but to accompany in humiliation, a heresy on the lips of a nun, but inevitable when salt cracked her tongue and hope was a luxury. In the dark, someone began to sing softly, a hymn in a lingua franca that few understood, but all felt. For an instant, the ship ceased to be a floating tomb and became a broken choir. Just an instant, before the strike of an oar on the deck brought back the silence. The arrival in Norway was no relief. On the contrary, it was the confirmation that the journey was only the prologue to a longer sentence. The warriors formed lines. The women were forced to kneel in the mud. The chieftain chose first 6 young women, including Bridge. Then by rank and reputation, the rest chose. Aldred was given to a farmer named Gunnar, who needed strong hands in the fields. What she interpreted as fortune, escaping the chief's harem, would over the years prove to be another sentence. Inhuman labor, a back bent until it broke, hands deformed by grain mills. The journey, in reality, had been a dark classroom. There the women learned that life was no longer measured in years or seasons, but in how long they lasted before breaking. They learned that beauty was a punishment, strength a reason for exploitation, and faith an echo that the sea swallowed without an answer. For those who survived, the memory of the ship remained as a shared scar. It was not just a transfer, it was a rite of passage into a world where they would cease to be people and become a function, a utility, a commodity. The sea continued to shine in the sun, indifferent. The ships would return time and again, loaded with new women, with children torn from distant villages. Every voyage repeated the same lesson, that violence could be organized efficiently, that suffering could be accounted for as profit, and that hope, in the middle of the hold, was a luxury as inaccessible as the dry land seen from afar. In the recently sacked village, the bodies were still smoking when Ragnar Ironhand, with a solemn step, began the inspection of his human booty. 200 women kneeling in the mud were lined up as if they were a freshly gathered harvest. The chieftain's gaze did not look for faces, it looked for signs: strength in the hands, the width of the hips, the symmetry of a face. A staff in his hand served as an instrument of classification, lifting chins, turning heads, parting tangled hair to evaluate teeth. What was humiliation for them was accounting for him. The first category was made up of the workers, older women, or those marked by the harshness of the fields. Marie was thrown in there. 30 years old, mother of 4, with muscles sculpted by years of milling. Ragnar saw in her calloused hands a safe investment, 10 years of labor before her body collapsed. That very afternoon, Marie was led to the grinding stones. The woman who had held the position died the day before, and Marie understood that she was inheriting not a job, but a sentence. The friction of the wood tore her skin from the first day. Over the years, her fingers would twist like dry roots, a living symbol of an endless sacrifice. The second category was the breeders, fertile young women who were to multiply their owner's property. Isabel, barely 16 years old, daughter of a minor noble fallen in battle, was assigned to that group. In less than a year, she gave birth to her first child, a boy whose existence meant neither lineage nor inheritance, but an increase in the slave inventory. In the following decade, she would have 7 more children, all taken from her side when they learned to walk. The maternal bond, systematically broken, was part of the equation. A mother chained to reproduction, unable to protect even her own blood. Isabel stopped calling herself a person. She became a womb at the service of a system. The third category was the most select and sinister, those for special use. There the most beautiful, the nobles, the virgins were gathered. Margaret, 20 years old, her face luminous even under tears, was chosen. Unlike Marie and Isabel, her fate would not be the anonymity of the fields or the harshness of incessant childbirth. Margaret was bathed, perfumed, and taught to repeat phrases in Greek, Arabic, and Slavic, not out of compassion, but because she was a luxury commodity destined for Byzantium or Baghdad. They fed her better, dressed her in fabrics that enhanced her figure. Every gesture was part of a training for auction, a theater where her body was transformed into a promise of exotic pleasure. What Ragnar executed swiftly was not improvisation. It was a precise architecture of female slavery. Each woman represented a function within an economic gear that extended from the sacked villages to international markets. The initial violence, the fire, the rape, the abduction, was only the first step. Then came the rationalization. Who would serve for the fields, who for reproduction, who for the luxury of distant kings? It was the industrialization of flesh, centuries before the word industry existed. This process was not limited to visible brutality. Deep down, it involved a calculated psychology. Marie was slowly broken until she believed her value was how many sacks of flour she produced a day. Isabel was molded to accept that her womb was someone else's property, her children extensions of another's estate. Marguerite was turned into an aspirational object, prepared for a sale that would tear her from every bond and make her the trophy of a foreign buyer. Power did not just dominate bodies, it rewrote identities. What is disturbing is recognizing that this classification repeats itself, disguised throughout history. The idea of separating women into workers, breeders, and luxury objects resonates even today in social and economic discourses where the female body is reduced to utility or aesthetics. The echo of Ragnar Ironhand resonates in modern offices, in textile factories, on runways that also commodify flesh under other labels. The past did not extinguish, it transformed. Marie died at 38, bent over the grinding stone. Isabel survived longer, but every child torn from her turned her into a specter. Marguerite, sold in an Eastern market, disappeared into a foreign palace, where her beauty was her sentence and her cage. 3 women, 3 different destinies, one same denominator, the conversion of life into a function. That was the dark alchemy of the Vikings, transmuting humanity into utility, pain into profit, flesh into a symbol of power. The murmur of the Dublin market in the year 852 was unlike that of any common fare. It did not smell of freshly baked bread or damp wool, but of fear and accumulated bodies. The women were brought up onto a 5-meter-high wooden platform so that everyone could observe them. Merchants shouted prices in 4 different languages, and buyers raised their hands as if they were not bidding on human beings, but on horses or weapons. There, Princess Orlith, naked under the sun, became a number. 24 silver marks paid by a merchant who would take her to Baghdad. Her lineage, her education, her beauty, everything was reduced to a sum that sealed her fate. Dublin had become the largest slave center in Western Europe. What was a scandal for Christian chroniclers was a perfectly calculated business for the Vikings. Ships arrived from Ireland, England, and Gaul loaded with young women. Others, by land, brought Slavic slaves from the east. Each group was separated by ethnicity, age, and physical condition. The logic was precise. Irish women sold well in Iceland, Frankish women in Byzantium, Slavic women fetched exorbitant prices in the Muslim caliphates. Geography dictated the value of female flesh. The conditions were cruel but not chaotic. There was a bureaucratic system that recorded every sale. A number was painted on the women's shoulders with ink that did not wash off easily, a marker that turned them into inventory. Inspectors checked teeth, scars, fertility. Pregnant women were auctioned as a double investment, a mother and her future child for the same price. Arab merchants asked about education. If the slave knew how to read, write, or sing, her value skyrocketed. In Constantinople, blonde girls were seen as exotic jewels. In Iceland, strong ones were preferred, capable of enduring endless winters. Ethnic diversity was transformed into a catalog of merchandise. This trade was not barbarian improvisation, it was primitive globalization. Through these markets, the Vikings connected Scandinavia with the Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and even Baghdad. The female body was Northern Europe's first transcontinental commodity, and the infrastructure that supported it anticipated mechanisms of the Atlantic slave trade centuries later. Insurance against loss, advance credits, networks of middlemen. In Hedeby, a Danish port, warehouses were organized where up to 500 women could be chained at once. They were fed just enough to keep them presentable without spending too much. Slave doctors isolated the sick to prevent an epidemic from reducing the value of the batch. The efficiency was so cold that it seemed modern. Contemporary accounts speak of women sold 20 or 30 times throughout their lives. Every sale was not a liberation, but a new violence. Gwen, a young Welsh woman, changed owners 17 times in 4 years. She lost her language, mixed words from 6 different tongues, but no longer remembered any fluently. The only thing she kept was silence. That constant transit was a strategy to prevent the slaves from forming bonds, from weaving networks of resistance, from remembering who they were. Uprooting was part of the merchandise. What is disturbing is how the market transformed even motherhood into a product. A slave who gave birth in the pens was shown as proof of fertility. The newborn, if it survived, was added as added value. There was no cradle or baptism, only a calculation, more working hands in the future. Life was accounted for as an investment, and death as a loss of capital. In this way, humanity was reduced to columns of numbers, to auction shouts, to records on wooden tablets. Today we walk through Dublin and see cafes, shops, and bustling streets. Beneath those stones, however, lie the remains of shackles and bones. Tourism celebrates Viking ships and steel swords, but rarely mentions that for 3 centuries that city was the largest women's market in Europe. Official memory preserves the glory of the merchants, not the lament of the captives. But the voices, though silenced, remain in the foundations. Every busy street is also a corridor where a woman was led in chains to an auction. The market was the culmination of the journey that began in raised villages and dark ships. There, the definitive conversion was completed, from daughter, mother, or sister into simple merchandise. And the most unsettling thing is that the same mechanisms, classification, valuation, public auction, continue to appear in history, albeit in different guises. The echo of Dublin resonates in every corner where the human body has been put up for sale. In Iceland, in the year 970, the Althing Assembly met under a cold, gray sky. There, on an elevated rock, the law speaker recited from memory the rules of the Gragas, the code that regulated the lives of free men, and the legal non-existence of slaves. His voice did not tremble as he proclaimed that a thrall woman could own nothing, could not testify, could not inherit. She was not a person. She was property. The echo of those words fell upon an audience that nodded as if listening to a psalm. In that voice, the fate of thousands of women was sealed, alive but erased. One example was enough to understand the cruelty of the law. Thorstein Redbeard had killed a slave named Asa during a dispute with his neighbor. She, Irish, 20 years old, a skilled weaver, mother of 2 children, lay dead in the field with her skull split open. But the trial did not discuss murder. The issue was damaged property. Thorstein had to pay 8 silver marks, the replacement value of a young woman skilled at the loom. The court did not mention her name. There was no mourning, no grief, just a cold calculation, equivalent to losing a sheep or a tool. The law also legitimized atrocious hospitality practices. A mourning gift allowed a master to lend his female slaves to guests. The woman became a temporary gift, a body handed over like a cup of wine. The children of those unions, far from creating bonds, reinforced chains. They were born slaves, automatically the property of the original owner. Thus, motherhood did not liberate, but multiplied captivity. Ragnhild, a slave of an Icelandic chieftain, was used in this way during an alliance banquet. From her womb was born a son who never had a father, only a master. He grew up with no identity, save the mark of being human inventory. The details of the Gragos revealed the extent to which the law could naturalize the inhumane. If a visitor injured a slave, he had to pay the owner, not the victim. If he left her incapacitated, the calculation was simple: the difference between the price of a healthy woman and a damaged one. The pain was not moral damage, but depreciation. This was experienced by Gudrun, violated by a merchant until she was left an invalid. Her owner received compensation for loss of working capacity. She, on the other hand, received nothing but the condemnation of continuing to serve in a broken body. The law even offered a cruel illusion of hope. A slave could aspire to freedom if she gave birth to 3 children who reached adulthood. But the statistics were impossible. Over 50% of slave children died before the age of 5. Many women did not survive successive pregnancies. In Icelandic records, barely a dozen women achieved such manumission. For most, the promise of freedom was another chain, a trap that pushed them to give birth until they died. It was not simple violence, it was the institutionalization of violence, turning into a norm what should have been a crime, making generations be born already marked, not by sin or destiny, but by statute. Female slavery in the Viking world was not just a practice, it was an ideology, inscribed in law, in custom, in religion. By accepting it as law, the community turned it into truth. And so for centuries, the voices of thousands of women could not even scream, "I am a person." The law had already decided they were not. In the great torchlit hall, Brianna stood motionless in a wedding dress that still smelled of smoke and blood. 3 days earlier, she had watched the Viking Eric behead her father and run her brothers through with spears. Now, forced to marry him, she was transformed into a symbol of conquest. The wedding was not a union, it was an absorption. Every guest understood it. By taking her as his wife, Eric not only gained lands, he gained legitimacy. The daughter's body became the notarized deed of the father's defeat. This pattern was repeated in Scotland, in France, in Saxony. Wherever Viking armies triumphed, noble daughters were forced into marriages that disguised rape with the word alliance. The goal was strategic: to blur the line between conqueror and conquered, to force the genealogy until future generations could not distinguish which blood was victory and which was defeat. The children of these unions bore the face of their defeated mother, but spoke the language of their conquering father. Brianna, barely 17 years old, silently understood the magnitude of the operation. Her personal resistance was insignificant against a system that had turned her into a political trophy. At night, while Eric slept, she went over in her memory the accounts she kept of her family, the languages she had learned, as if they were invisible relics that no one could yet take from her. But she knew her womb would soon seal the alliance with offspring. Those children would be the living proof that the Irish nobility could survive, only as a shadow within the Viking lineage. Brianna's case was no exception. In Scotland, the daughter of a Mormaer was forced to marry the man who had strangled her father. In France, a widow had to share a bed with her husband's murderer so the new owner could claim the lands. In Saxony, a princess was forced to accept as her husband the chieftain who had burned her city and executed 300 of its citizens. In every story, the same script: death of the men, absorption of the women, legalization of the conquest through forced marriage. What is disturbing is that this mechanism was not exclusive to the Viking world. Empires throughout time have used women as bridges of legitimacy, from Alexander marrying Persian princesses to medieval kings sealing treaties with strategic weddings. But in the Nordic case, the violence was explicit. There was no negotiation, only massacre and appropriation. That crudeness turned every marriage into a bloody reminder of who was in charge. Some women found ways to resist. They sang lullabies in their native tongue, disguised genealogies in seemingly harmless songs, secretly passed down stories of their lineage. Others resorted to poison, like Gudrun of the Hebrides, who waited 10 years to kill the man who had taken everything from her. But most simply survived, transformed into living hostages whose existence guaranteed the obedience of entire communities. Modern genetic studies confirm this. While the male line in Iceland is predominantly Scandinavian, the female line is mostly Celtic. It was not romantic unions that created this mixing, but forced marriages like Brianna's. The conquest was written not only on parchments or in sagas, but in the wombs of women. And in that brutal pedagogy, the lesson was clear. Power is not only exercised with swords, but also with weddings. A woman bound at the altar served as a living contract, as proof that the enemy had not only been defeated, but absorbed. For the Vikings, nothing consolidated victory better than making a king's daughter their own wife and her offspring, heirs who no longer remembered the defeat as an affront, but as an origin. The smoke from Sigurd's funeral ship had dissipated centuries ago when modern scientists began studying Iceland's DNA. The results were devastating. 62% of the paternal line was Scandinavian, but 63% of the maternal line was Celtic, mainly Irish and Scottish. Those figures were much more than statistics. They were the genetic footprint of thousands of women torn from their villages and forced to bear the children of their captors. The history written by sagas and chronicles omitted their names. Biology, on the other hand, preserved their cry in the blood of their descendants. Archaeology confirmed what the chronicles only hinted at. In Dublin, excavations uncovered corroded shackles, remains of pens, mass graves. In Hedeby, stone cells capable of chaining 500 women. In Sweden, ship burials with multiple female bodies, bodies that showed no signs of disease but of strangulation or fatal wounds. Violence had become a ritual, and the ritual had become normality. What is disturbing is not just the number of deaths, but the naturalness with which suffering was celebrated as part of the world order. The subsequent forgetting was almost as cruel as the slavery itself. Nordic museums exhibit elegant ships, ornate swords, gold necklaces, but rarely explain that those treasures were bought with the sale of women in Byzantium or Baghdad. The bravery of the explorers who reached America is admired, but it is omitted that their voyages were financed with profits from human trafficking. Tourism celebrates the myth of the noble and adventurous Viking. It remains silent on the fact that 500,000 women disappeared as merchandise, and yet memory survives in unexpected ways. Certain medieval ballads that seem to speak of impossible loves hide the laments of enslaved women. Some orally transmitted tales in Iceland include nameless female characters weeping by the sea, shadows of captives erased from official records. The very silence in the sagas, which barely mention thralls as background figures, is a negative testimony. Their absence screams louder than their presence. The trauma was intergenerational. Children born into slavery learned from a young age that their bodies did not belong to them. Daughters grew up knowing they would be merchandise like their mothers. Sons saw the humiliation of their mothers and sisters without being able to intervene, learning powerlessness as an inheritance. That chain of pain-shaped behaviors, fear of rebelling, hypervigilance, emotional dissociation. Current studies on trauma suggest that these footprints can even be transmitted biologically, like invisible scars inscribed in DNA. The lesson is not limited to the past. The use of the female body as a weapon of war, as spoils of conquest, as a tool of terror, continues to be repeated in the contemporary conflicts. From Bosnia to Rwanda, from Syria to Ukraine, sexual violence has been used with the same logic applied by the Vikings. It is not an excess, it is a strategy. By remembering Sigrid and 500,000 anonymous women, we are not evoking an exotic chapter of ancient barbarism, but a pattern that remakes itself every century in new uniforms. The story ends in ashes, but it must not end in silence, because every erased name can at least be evoked. Sigrid, Bridge, Marie, Isabel, Marguerite, Orlith, Ragnhild, Gudrun, names that pierce through the fog to remind us that the glory of a civilization can be built upon the invisible blood of the women who did not choose to be part of it. To remember them is to snatch a moment of dignity from oblivion. It is to declare that their pain was not collateral, but central. It is to recognize that the memory of Europe is not built solely on churches and castles, but also on slave pens and funeral ships. And it is to understand that, as long as we continue to celebrate the Vikings as heroes without speaking of the women they consumed, we continue to participate in the same silence that erased them. Sigrid died in 922, but her smoke continues to travel. It travels in genes, in incomplete legends, in the questions we ask ourselves in front of museums that remain silent. It travels in every woman who still fights today against the conversion of her body into merchandise. The duty of those who listen is simple. Do not let those voices remain only ashes. Name them, recognize them, admit that they existed, that they mattered, that their suffering built the world we inhabit. That is the minimum justice we can offer.